Good afternoon, everyone. My name is I'm the chair of the UK chapter of the Internet Society, and we today have a webinar that's got the illustrious Nigel Hickson joining us, and it's on Internet governance post-crisis, a new normal. Now, Nigel will probably introduce himself and say a little bit about himself to start with, but we've known Nigel for quite a number of years. He has been working for ICANN, and before he was working for DCMS and the organizations prior to DCMS. He has years and years of experience in internet governance, both in the multi-stakeholder side of the model, but also at ITU, at United Nations, and in many different fora. We're very happy to have him today, being able to speak to us about this topic, especially since I've seen, and we've seen Nigel around the world many times in more countries than I can count. Now, of course, COVID-19 means we're all confined, and that of course makes a difference to not only the way that this is undertaken, but internet governance as well. And certainly when it comes down to the new norm, the new norm might be very different, or the new normal might be very different today than it used to be before. So I don't want to ramble on too much, but the way that we'll do this is to have Nigel go through his presentation, and then I'm looking forward to listen to the discussion. If you have questions and so on, I gather you'll all be able to chime in by logging in on Zoom. You've got your microphone. I should ask that if you're not speaking, please mute your mic. If you have, then it'd be great when you speak, or even in between, to have the video on as well. That's pretty much what I needed to say. We should be spending about an hour altogether. So I know Nigel's really efficient, and we should go through the presentation and his arguments to start with rather quickly, and then we'll have hopefully a very good discussion. So Nigel Hickson, welcome, and over to you. And so I'll be dealing with the slides, and so when you want the slide deck on, please let me know, and I'll share the deck. Thank you.
Yes, well, thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed, Olivier, and good afternoon, good morning, or whatever to everyone. I guess most people are in Europe, so it's good afternoon. Good afternoon to you, and it's a pleasure speaking in a UK ISOC chapter meeting. It really is. As Olivier said, I've been round the block a bit on this sort of issue, I suppose. I was with the UK government for 30 years, and I left in 2012 to join ICANN. First of all in the European office, looking after sort of their European stakeholder engagement policies, etc. And then after a couple of years, I went to Geneva to be responsible there for the relationship between ICANN and the international government organizations, the UN, the WTO, WIPO, and a number of other organizations. So my role in ICANN has been very much outward facing on internet governance issues, whether they're being discussed at the OECD or the UN or the ITU or whatever. I left ICANN in February, and since then I've been, I suppose, freelancing, as they say. I'm not really sure what that means yet, but I've been doing a bit of work for a couple of organisations. But it's a pleasure to be involved again in organisations like the Internet Society, and very happy to be involved in such discussions. So what I plan to do was talk for about 20 minutes or something, and then let's have a fairly robust discussion. And one of the advantages, of course, of not of having no master, so to speak, is that I can speak, I suppose, fairly freely. And I mean, some of you might say that I used to do that anyway, which probably explains why I never got very far. But But I think, being out of an organization does allow you to perhaps say a few things that you wouldn't normally say. So Olivier, if you could put up the agenda slide, and then I can just mention what I'm just going to cover. So I thought I would just say a few things about my own view of what I think we've learned about the internet and about internet governance during this this crisis, if you like, and then perhaps focus on some of the critical issues that are in front of us and have not gone away. I mean, this is one of the factors that we always have to take account of. And then what could and should we be doing, I suppose, and some of the opportunities ahead. So that's how I'll focus it. So in terms of the crisis, I mean, crisis, what crisis for those of us in the UK, and I know there's quite a few of us in the UK on the list here. What crisis was said by a UK Prime Minister many years ago in relation to a series of public sector strikes, and it became a bit of an expression that people used when they're describing something which is clearly a crisis, but perhaps is not understood as such by some politicians. And so the phrase here is by no means to belittle the crisis that we're all going through in this pandemic. I mean, which is of course of a great, is a really serious nature. And yeah, so I'm not trying to belittle the crisis at all, but I think what we have learned through this crisis is fundamentally the importance of the internet. So what I'll try and do in the next 20 minutes or so is to really try and focus on what we've learned from this crisis and what we should be doing in the future. But if we could go to the next slide. So one of the sort of comments I recall at the beginning of this of the crisis, of course, was as various countries and particularly in Europe went into lockdown, there was this real sort of pent up concern that would the internet stand up? Would we be able to carry on communicating with each other? Would everything get too slow? Would we be able to do conference calls? Would we be able to transact business across the internet? Would we be able to see our loved ones and our friends on Skype or on Zoom or whatever? And of course, the answer's been yes. The networks have stood up pretty well, both locally and globally. And whether you look at what the studies that the OECD have done on this, or the ITU, or a number of the other organizations, that the general conclusion so far, I'm not saying that anything is over so far, is that yes, networks have stood up pretty well. Internet traffic is perhaps up 30 or 40% globally. In some areas it's up 60% in terms of certain types of application. Perhaps it's more at certain times of the day, but generally the networks have held up very well. And that, I think, is tremendously important. We'll come back to that. We've also learned, of course, that there's been dialogue between tech companies and the governments. The same tech companies which only back in, if you like, January and February were being seen by many politicians in Europe and elsewhere of being out of control, of being out of touch or something. Those same tech companies have worked with governments, have worked with the European Commission, have worked with other players in terms of their concerns, in terms of their response to this crisis. So I think there's a lesson to be learned which we can come back to. And cybercrime, yes, I'm not diminishing the effect of cybercrime at all. And indeed, there's been lots of evidence from ICANN and from other bodies of the various frauds that have taken place, of the use of WHO names, of the use of COVID names, etc., whether it's to be providing false advice, or whether it's providing fake news, or whether it's selling medicines, or whatever. So that's certainly not to be you know, sneezed at all. But certainly cybercrime is a real issue, but it hasn't been an overarching issue across the whole network. It hasn't brought networks down. So if we go to the next slide. So, you know, what did we really learn? That this internet thing is pretty important, and we'll come back to this, because I think this is the crux of the whole message, that this internet that, you know, perhaps we do sometimes take for granted, has really come into its own. This internet that many of us, you know, 20 years ago were talking up as something that would liberate, you know, that would create democracies, that would liberate tyrannies, that would do all sorts of things, the John Perry Barlow arguments of 20, 25 years ago, of course, they've all gone. And to an extent, we got into this negative area of having to defend the internet all the time. Yes, it was always, you know, you read a paragraph about the internet and it always says, yes, the internet is, you know, really useful for economic liberalization and for cheap public services and for doing this and doing that. But look at the negative, look at the fake news, look at the child images, look at the cybercrime, look at, you know, all this. And to an extent, we perhaps have overlooked the fundamental issues about the internet, this connectivity, this ability to connect us all together, whether on a personal, on a social, on a political, or on an economic level. That the internet is singular. Again, we take this for granted, and why should we not take this for granted? It's something that I often try out on people in social, you know, social occasions, saying, you know, the internet is single. What would it be like if it wasn't single? And people say, well, but the internet is single. It's because it's the internet. And then you can introduce the debate, well, actually, a lot of people would perhaps not like the internet to be single, or only singular on their terms. That the digital divide is still a key issue. Yes, it certainly is a key issue. Those of us that have experienced Zoom calls and other types of calls have seen the problems that some people have. I mean, obviously, if you haven't got access to the internet at all, that's a fundamental problem. But even if you have got access to the internet and your bandwidth is low and your latency is high, or whatever, then there are problems. And of course, the crisis management involves an array of different stakeholders. That during this pandemic, governments and stakeholders have come together in many different areas. Can we just go back to the other slide? Oh yeah, sorry, just go. That Zoom is not a nice lolly. Yes, I put this in and then I thought this. Zoom used to be something that was sold as an ice cream back in the UK years and years ago, and for many people, you know, when you say, have you been doing Zoom calls? They said, yes, but, you know, up till the beginning of March, I didn't know what Zoom was about, or up to the beginning of April, I didn't know what Zoom was about. So it's interesting how the terminology has changed to an extent. That online working is exhausting. I put this down because this links us back to the future discussion to an extent, in that you know, the online working and virtual working is not a panacea. Being able to engage in dialogue with a range of stakeholders on a Zoom call is not easy. It's not something that is trivial. And indeed, there's been, you know, studies that the World Health Organization and other bodies have carried out to talk about the way that your physical interactions your physical interactions, where you pick up nuances in body language, etc., are far less exhausting than they are when you're trying to do it and look at everyone on a Zoom call. The books you read, of course, this is always interesting in that you look at people's backdrops and many people, of course, on television and that being presented are of course, you know, you've been looking at what books people read. So it's been interesting. The dialogue, you know, some forms of dialogue are more effective than others. This might seem trivial, and Olivia, go on to the next slide if you like. So I mean, because this I think is just a point to be made, because, you know, in lessons for the future, some types of calls, some types of interaction work so much better on Zoom than you might expect, or on other virtual platforms. But other types of discussions do not work so well. And so, you know, our typical, I was talking to someone earlier this afternoon from government, and they were saying how well the OECD meetings that some of us attended a couple of months ago went so well. It's because, you know, in an OECD meeting, you have a very good chair, they go around the room, people make interventions, the secretariat sums up, the chair sums up, and that's it, you know. So that sort of discussion works well. I think what we're doing now works pretty well as well, where someone presents, and then, you know, there's chat to keep the issues alive while I'm talking, and then, you know, there's the opportunity for dialogue and questions. I think that works well when you're putting information over and having a discussion. But, you know, if we were drafting a treaty, if we were drafting an ITU document, if we were drafting something politically significant and we had it on the screen, how much more difficult would that be then? You know, in our coffee breaks that we used to have at the ITU, when we used to go and discuss with other countries, you know, what the situation should be, or how we were going to move forward on a compromise. How that can be done effectively on Zoom, of course, is a different matter. So, you know, online decision making is difficult, and of course that we do miss face-to-face meetings, and we do miss, you know, the so-called water cooler meeting. Water cooler discussions. We miss this physical interaction with our colleagues. We miss this ability to see people and to understand where they're coming from. So, you know, some things will not be the same again. The new normal, whatever the new normal is going to look like, is going to be fundamentally different. Some of these large organizations that we're talking about, you know, the ITU, the OECD, or whatever, are already talking internally. I mean, this is no secret. I mean, why wouldn't an organization talk internally? I'm sure it's the same for employers around the world are talking about what the new normal will be. Yes, they're not going to immediately scrap offices. They're not going to go to a completely online model. They're not going to say to their employees, you should never meet again together. You know, but there are going to be fundamental decisions taken in terms of economy or in whatever that are going to change our lives completely in the future. Okay, if we could go to the next slide. So I wanted to say, you know, a bit about some of the critical issues, of course, that have not gone away. And you might say, well, you know, why should critical issues go away? And indeed, why should they go away? But I think it's important that as we come out of this lockdown, and hopefully we will come out of this lockdown as we engage again in various discourses, that we remember, that we reflect on what is going on, what is the status of internet governance. And for those of us been around for a while, many of us are deeply concerned about the state of internet governance. Now, whether that is because of what I was saying earlier, in that the negatives about the use of the internet for various purposes have come to the fore in political debates. You know, whenever a minister, it's interesting to see, and you know, people like Philip Virgo on the call will be able to reflect on this from his experience. You know, 20 years ago, when we were starting to get ministers engaged in the internet, when they wanted to give a speech about the internet or the World Wide Web, they wanted positive examples. They wanted to talk about the baker that was selling cakes in China, whereas before they'd only sold them in Halifax or Scunthorpe or whatever. They wanted to talk about lastminute.com. They wanted to talk about the opportunities that the internet might give to education, to social issues, to personal issues. It was very much an opportunity, talking up the opportunities that the internet gave, that the World Wide Web gave. It was to do with that. That's what ministers, politicians wanted to talk about. Now, of course, it's very different. Politicians, to an extent, want to talk about, or do talk about, some of the more negative things about the internet, how the internet should be more secure, how it should not allow this fake news, etc., 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 and this confusion about the internet and the applications that run on the internet. And so the language has become much more complicated, and that's, that's inevitable. As some things mature, we get into a much more nuanced debate about things. But we have lost, to an extent, that debate on the positive issues that the internet brings. And so I think that helps us reflect on the fact that the critical differences between countries on the governance of the internet, I mean, obviously goes right back to the WSIS agenda in 2003 and 2005, and we needn't go back that long, and before that to the creation of ICANN, of course. But this differences in perceptions that people have about how the internet should be governed, what is the role of stakeholders and what is the role of governments, has never gone away. I mean, it's gone up and down in terms of a graph, if you like, of importance and non-importance at certain times, but it's never gone away. And certainly my perception, and the perception I think of quite a few people, is that we are at a fairly critical time at the moment. We're at a critical time in New York, where we have these discussions in the open-ended working group and the government group of experts on cybersecurity, discussions that are fundamentally multilateral, that include stakeholders a bit on the edge, but that are fundamentally multilateral. We have a new group, the open-ended ad hoc intergovernmental committee of experts. Who comes up with these acronyms? We'll be looking at a cybercrime treaty. Now, okay, so they're looking at a cybercrime treaty. The first meeting of this group is not till August 2020, so we don't know what sort of group it's going to be. We don't know whether it will have any advisory stakeholders. The open-ended working group in New York at least had some stakeholders to some of their meetings, but not the decision-making meetings. We don't know about the open-ended ad hoc Internetal OECE group. What we do know is that the purpose of setting this up is because some UN countries would like a new cybercrime treaty. They're not happy that we have the Budapest Convention, which was fundamentally drawn up by the Council of Europe as the bedrock of international treaties on cybercrime. They would like something else. And then, of course, we've got, not the subject of this talk, but no doubt the subject of future talks, the new IP proposals that originated last year in the ITU forum, that came up in TSAG and in some of the ITU-T working groups that are being discussed in the ITU. And of course, it's great that proposals are being discussed in the ITU. That's what the ITU is for, to foster proposals. But these proposals about a new internet protocol are certainly quite worrying. They were discussed at the IETF a month or so ago, and there was a fairly heated dialogue there as well. And there is some parallel discussions going on in ETSI as well in relation to 5G services and whether TCP is going to be sufficient for the new rollout of 5G services and the Internet of Things, etc. The importance of all this is simply to be able to react, to be in a position to react to these proposals as they're being discussed, and to be able to input the facts and the understanding and the views and the opinions of the technical community, the business community, and whoever into these discussions. And no doubt we can discuss these further. Okay, next slide, if you may. So, what could and should we do? And this really is more for the discussion than perhaps anything else. And here I don't become controversial so much, but I think I would say that we might, as the technical community, to an extent, have lost our way in some of this, in some of these dialogues. It was the technical community that, going back to the WSIS days, was fundamental, along with our business and civil society colleagues, were fundamental in putting different views on the table in Geneva. Yes, in those early days of the WSIS, it was difficult for the technical community, civil society, and business stakeholders to have their say. We could attend certain types of meetings and we were thrown out of other types of meetings. But we were insistent that people heard what we had to say. We were insistent that people heard what we said about TCP, what we said about the fundamental principles of the internet in terms of end-to-end, in terms of connectivity, in terms of security, in terms of stability. We were emphatic in our sense that the internet, the governance of the internet, had to be something that was engaged in by all stakeholders. That was our line at the WSIS. That was our line during the Wicket discussions in 2012 in Dubai. And indeed, I think there's been a good track record of organizations like ISOC, ICANN, along with civil society and business in putting down markers. But perhaps sometimes lately we've been rather too hesitant. Yes, we have been there to provide facts, and there's nothing wrong in providing factual information. Indeed, it's good to provide factual information. It helps people understand the differences between the internet and the applications that run on it, at the different levels, etc., etc. Factual information is the bedrock of good decision-making. Nothing wrong with that at all. But surely we're about more than factual information. We're about speaking up for the principles that we held so dear in the early days of the internet, in having an open internet, in having a single internet, in having innovation at the edge, in having stability, in having connectivity. Those were the, if you like, the principles that we fought for during the WSIS. It's the principles that we elaborated in the OECD discussions many years ago. It's the principles that we had in Net Mondial back in 2014. And these are the principles that we should be upholding. These are the principles that we should be taking to these discussions in New York and Geneva and elsewhere. So I think that there is an opportunity to speak to our governments on processes which are neither inclusive or involve stakeholders, in challenging our governments on why these processes do not involve stakeholders, do not involve any input from others. Who knows about the G7 ministerial that's taking place on technology and science? Next week, there's a virtual ministerial. It's planned for the end of next week on technology and science, a G7 ministerial. It's been arranged only over perhaps the last few weeks. It's a US hosted, of course, but do we know the agenda? Do we know what the declaration is going to say? Do we know anything about these discussions? What do we know about the government group of experts? These 25 experts sitting around a table in New York. What do we know about what they're discussing? What do we know about what they're saying about the new internet protocols? What do we know they're saying about other critical issues? These are the discussions that we should be telling our governments that we're not happy that there's no consultation taking place. We shouldn't be hesitant in speaking up the internet, especially as we mentioned earlier, that the internet has been so fundamental that having a single, open, end-to-end, stable, secure internet has been so fundamental during this COVID-19 crisis. We should not be hesitant in speaking up the internet, and we should be engaging in New York and elsewhere to make sure our voice is heard. Before I finish, I had one slide which I don't think, for some reason, I didn't make the pack, and it's only my fault, of course. And that was of opportunities. And let me just mention two opportunities that I think we do have before we get on to the, yes, the slide missing, on opportunities. And the two areas that I was going to mention under opportunities, one, and we won't really know what sort of opportunity it is. As some of us know, last year, the United Nations set up a high-level panel on digital cooperation. In June last year, the high-level panel on digital cooperation produced a report, The Age of Internet Interdependence. That report had a lot in it. It had some excellent points about the internet, about the need for diverse participation in digital cooperation. It didn't talk about internet governance as such, but it talked about the way that discussions on decisions, etc., had to be informed by a diverse range of opinions, a diverse range of people. It had recommendations concerning the Internet Governance Forum. It had recommendations concerning the appointment of a technology envoy. And the recommendations that came out in June in this report were discussed at the IGF last year, and they've been discussed in various other fora, and different stakeholders and governments have been meeting together to produce what's called a roadmap. And this roadmap is going to be launched at some point, perhaps even as early as next month. And this might well be, depending on what it says, of course, this might well be an opportunity for us in the technical community or the business community or in civil society to be able to leverage some of the messages in that roadmap. The other opportunity, of course, is the IGF itself in Poland, whether it's going to be virtual or whether it's going to be physical. I suspect perhaps virtual. But again, the IGF coming at an important time, hopefully after the worst of the crisis is over, a time to reflect on the importance of the internet, a time to reflect on the fundamental nature that the internet has played in our economic and social and business lives during this crisis. So that, I think, is something that we need to reflect on as well. So I think I'll finish there. I've been talking long enough. I'm afraid I haven't had a chance to look at the chat, but I'll do that. I'll do that now, and of course, happy to engage in debate and discussion. But if I could just finally, in the last 30 seconds of what I'm going to say, reiterate that we must use this opportunity. We must use this opportunity of the knowledge of what a single, open, secure internet can do for society, for business, and for personal life to, if you like, ensure that that message is heard over and above the more negative messages that are heard as well. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Joe, and thanks for this comprehensive introduction and thought-provoking and a few points. And it's great to hear you being able to speak without having someone watching over your shoulder at the time. Although, as you said, you're usually pretty free to speak. Now, a discussion now, and the way, if you want to participate in the discussion, is in two ways. You either type in your question or comment in the chat. I see there's already a big life going on in the chat, back and forth. But you can also get into the queue by putting your hand up. Now, for those people who are not familiar with Zoom, if you select at the bottom participants, it will give you a participants list, and it will allow you to also then put your hand up. There's a way. If you can't, just write in the chat and say, I'd be interested in saying something, or write hand up, and I'll try and make up the whole system of hands going forward. Now, we'll start with Andrew Campling. And by the way, when you speak, it'd be great to see your video as well. If you can't have video, then that's up to you. But it's great to turn it on, at least for the time when you speak. So, Andrew, you have the floor.
Great. Thank you, Olivier and Nigel. Hopefully you can hear me okay. Just a couple of quick observations and then perhaps some more controversial points. So very briefly first on the observations, Nigel, that was a very helpful run through. Just in terms of the crisis, what crisis point, I mean, certainly from the work I've been doing with most of the European, some North American operators, most of them, they're not seeing traffic levels in the daytime above their normal evening peaks. So on the whole, networks in general have held up well, which I think broadly in line with what you said. There have been a few isolated issues where some of the big game developers have put out unscheduled game downloads, which has stressed some of the evening peaks needlessly. But I think some of the governments are now encouraging, shall we say, the game developers to talk to ISPs and CDNs to manage that more sensibly. So that's probably a good thing. In terms of what we really learned, just two very brief points. Firstly, on Zoom, I think what we really learned is that just working matters much more than the clever bells and whistles in things like WebEx and Teams, which arguably have got a lot more functionality, but are far, far less reliable and have got a far more complex user interface. So I think that's a good proof point for anyone that easy to use is what matters. The other point on what we really learned is for enterprise VPNs, they never were configured for 100% remote working with video calls. And rather embarrassingly, even one extremely large US network operator was unable to give its remote workers video calls because its VPN would have fallen over. So that's much more down to VPN design than underlying network capacity issues. They just hadn't configured their servers properly. Now, more interestingly though, in terms of looking ahead, I'll give you three brief observations which you may or may not disagree with, may not agree with. Firstly, that the move to centralization driven by a lot of the new standards developments is a huge concern, and I'd be really worried in 2 or 3 years' time whether we'd have the same degree of resilience on the internet, and that is unfortunately down to international standards development, and that needs to be fixed. The tech companies are driving standards in ways which favour them and not which favour network resilience. And that has to be called out and dealt with. And dare I say it, that goes hand in glove with my second point, which is in terms of the role of stakeholders, I'd look at a different set of stakeholder involvements than the ones that you did. I think it's shameful, the lack of multi-stakeholder involvement in standards development. In reality, most standards are driven by the tech community, and the views of other stakeholders are, if I'm being polite, ignored. At best, were never really considered in the first place. And being honest, the IGF is not a decision-making body. The decisions on standards are made in the IETF and the related bodies, and you don't get diversity of stakeholder engagement in that body, and that needs to be fixed. And then finally, I would politely suggest there are some huge advantages to a splinternet. Rather than a single internet, because frankly, there are different policy requirements in Europe, certainly different policy priorities in Europe versus the US, China or Russia. So at the moment, we're sort of forced to take on board the priorities of the US, whether we want them or not. I would argue that there'll be some quite significant benefits to Europe by separating its internet from that of the US, have it connected but separate, because some of the direction of travel of the US internet is not fit for purpose outside of the US, in my view. So they're my thoughts.
Thanks for this, Andrew. Nigel, any thoughts on the points that Andrew Campling was making?
Well, yes, I mean, very, controversial as well. I mean, I think it's best to collect a number of points, probably, Olivier. But I mean, the one point I would make I would make is that I think you're absolutely right on the standards point. I mean, you know, the multi-stakeholder, you know, approach to decision making, etc., doesn't, you know, is not all dominated by governments. I shouldn't suggested that. I mean, it's just as bad when it's dominated by business or dominated by the technical community or whatever. And indeed, you know, the fact that governments have turned round to the technical community and said, why did we agree this particular standard in the IETF? Why wasn't governments involved that have law enforcement, you know, law enforcement priorities, et cetera, in some of this decision making? So yeah, I agree with that point. Olivier, do you want to pick another question?
I think we'll continue. Yes, Andrew Sterling is next.
Thank you. Can you hear me all right?
Absolutely. Go ahead, Andrew.
Excellent. Thank you. Yes, probably following on a little bit from the other Andrew's comments, which really to wonder whether the governance is a little bit at risk of the fallout between the US and China in terms of power grabbing, or, you know, is this the era for the big blocks, or is it such that a small nimble player like the UK or others could play a part in influencing that?
Thanks for this. Very interesting. Nigel?
Well, yes. I mean, I totally agree with you. I mean, I think we are. It was very interesting at the, you know, at some of the recent global dialogues that took place last year at the UN or the IGF, that, you know, some people characterized that there's now three ways on the internet. There's the Chinese way, there's the sort of US way, and which Andrew was reflecting on to an extent, and then there's the European way, the middle way, the more pragmatic, you know, the more pragmatic approach. And I'm not, you know, trying to suggest the UK or any individual country has got all the answers on this, but you know, clearly there is a role for perhaps more pragmatic thinking in certain areas.
Did you have a follow up on this, Andrew?
Yes. So is that your feeling then that we should work within Europe to create a European voice, or is there too much divergence in Europe? Do we have to find a different way to get our point to resonate?
Well, I suppose it depends, you know, the fora we're in. I mean, clearly, I mean, the UK has got an excellent record. I mean, I'm not with the government now, and whether they'd ever have me back, you never know. But I mean, I think, you know, the pragmatism was a word used about, you know, our internet policies to an extent, and I think, you know, a lot of Europe has followed the UK lead. I'm not suggesting other European countries don't also have a significant input to play, but I just think that, you know, we have to stand up also as the technical community ourselves. We have to say what we believe in. I mean, I read a piece. You know, I read a piece the other day about the internet protocol, and this was written way, you know, this was written not in terms of a conflict between anything else, but it was just pointing out the differences between the, if you like, the design objectives of TCP and the way the internet has been developed, and the design objectives of some of the proposals in the new IP that Huawei put forward at the UN at the ITU meetings last year. I mean, they're fundamentally different. I mean, that doesn't mean to say it's wrong to put forward, you know, proposals for a new internet based on on differences, but we ought to acknowledge what those differences are. Those differences are that whereas TCP at the moment is, you know, well, I was an engineer years ago, but you know, it's archaic to an extent. You know, it doesn't fit into a box. What Huawei is suggesting in the paper they presented to the ITU last year is a very much top-down model, where governments can have much more control over the routing and of the packets, and about how the whole thing fits together. And, you know, if we are concerned about those differences, then we should speak about those differences.
Yeah, thank you.
Let's get next is Philip Virgo.
Hi. First, I want to say how much I agree with the comments made by Andrew Campling and how much I like Nigel's intro. I think that the really big difference is that the internet is now a core part of the world's critical infrastructure for everybody. And that includes all sorts of people who were left out and they're part of the digitally excluded or what have you, and they get on with difficulty or not at all. And that actually means a completely different approach. And as Nigel said, you know, Huawei comes to this from the perspective of a telecoms engineer as opposed to an internet man. And I began my life as the trainee computer programmer in a hostel full of telecoms engineers. And they were trying to put first generation microwave on top of mountain tops in Brazil, where it was never going to see an engineer more than about once every other year, where my IBM mainframe got taken down once a week and best efforts and all sorts of other things. There are two completely different perspectives on the way forward now that the world has come in large part to depend on the internet, and somehow we have to reconcile the two and get a win-win. But that really does require some rethinking and opening up some discussions that were previously very much taboo. I don't know what the answers are. I'm simply saying we really have to open this up much more widely.
Nigel?
Yeah, no, well, I agree with you, Philip, and I think, you know, we've, I mean, you and I have debated some of these points, you know, over the years, and we've seen how the interest of politicians and how the whole political scene has changed dramatically. But yeah, I think, you know, we have to be more, we have to be articulate. We have to be able to point out what our positions are. And as others have said on the call, I mean, it's no longer just sufficient to turn up at an ITU meeting or you know, a big global summit and speak one's mind. One has to also be able to get involved in the standards making process and some of the detailed negotiations that take place in the peripheries of multilateral forums.
I would add, we've also got the problem that the goose that laid the golden eggs has just been somewhat slaughtered, in that the advertising revenues that have been paying for everybody's wet dreams have suddenly dried up. And basically that means business cases, funding cases have to be rethought as well.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Nigel, for sharing your thoughts. I think they're extremely important, and thank you for this opportunity to debate this. I think that overall, whilst I agree with something that's been said, that we're seeing this repetition of netheads versus bellheads again, and we know that history repeats itself. I really think we ought to think what can be done about that. And having looked at the crisis, the other crisis at the Oxford Internet Institute around 2008, financial crisis, we were asking similar questions in terms of should the internet governance change and in which fashion to accommodate, and would the financial fall have really extreme effects on the internet itself? And, you know, whilst it was too early to look and to see that the internet continued to be stable, we never asked at which cost. And we see that now we are seeing from centralization and different kind of business models maintaining the capacity of the internet, but at the same time, I agree with Andrew, losing its resilience with centralization. My concern, and I wonder whether you have any thoughts about this, is that with all these discussions going not really dark, but being online, how can we hit this problem that we've seen even, as I say, 12 years ago, more funding to have more voices and diversity and inclusion into the debate? I think it comes down to some support of the institutions and the participants to actively participate in these questions.
Nigel?
Yeah, no, well, I mean, I think you said something, you know, that's fundamentally important, and I mean something that I should have, you know, I should clearly have mentioned in that, you know, one of the real dangers of the new normal, and we don't know what the new normal will be, but we shouldn't, you know, we shouldn't kid ourselves that, you know, I'm not trying to dismiss the benefit of the virtual environment over the physical environment. I mean, of course, it has many benefits in terms of climate change, in terms of even diversity to an extent. I mean, in that you can include perhaps more people on online participation than you can physically. But what you can't do online is you know, these online dialogues we're having. We're here because, if you like, the institutions that we're having the dialogue with is allowing us the dialogue. And so the agenda for the online dialogue and the rules and the standards and that is being set by the institution itself. And that, of course, is you know, is potentially dangerous, you know. So we can have this discussion, you know, so the ITU or whoever, I'm not trying to convene a discussion like this, and it can have someone, you know, chairing it that's open and able to command a lot of different voices, and we can all have a wonderful discussion and come up with ideas. And then the real discussion is held in the so-called council or the Senate or whatever the, you know, the decision-making body is, and none of us are there at all, and none of these ideas are necessarily reflected. So I think, yes, I mean, we have some, you know, we have our work cut out to ensure that the new normal has this diverse participation, which we're able to have online amongst ourselves.
Thank you. So even more transparency rather than diversity.
Well, absolutely. I mean, yeah, it's just, yeah, fundamental. I mean,
Thanks for this, Nigel. I've now changed. Apparently, my sound wasn't that great, so I've changed that. Next is Philip Inglesand.
Myself. Oh, I can just unmute myself. Right. Okay. I mean, I suppose one of the observations from this current crisis is that it's very disruptive or destructive, even in Schumpeterian sort of terms, and it's not that these are necessarily bad destructions. But they're happening far too quickly, really. So, for example, the comment about the collapse in advertising revenue. I mean, that whole model of kind of selling bits of paper and on the back of it you put advertisements, and that way you can fund news information and so on. I mean, that's been broken for quite a long time, and certainly moving on to the internet hasn't really fixed very much. But it's having it suddenly collapse is kind of like a problem. How do we get this time? We absolutely desperately need reliable news. To have the collapse of or near collapse of long established news information sources is actually quite disastrous. So, you know, and this thinking about another example where moving increasingly to online working, which is not a bad thing, as Nigel, sorry, has just said, but it's happening so fast, and you know, the offices are already there and they're being built, and a lot of office companies are going to find themselves in a great deal of difficulty. It's just happening far too quickly. I was just earlier on in a very interesting discussion under the auspices of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on digital analytics, and one of the discussions there was around centralization versus decentralization as in extremely general terms, as a way to govern things in very general terms. But of course, the internet came up as an example of a very decentralized governance, and the problem of now retrofitting some of the things that should, if we were going to design the internet for today, 30 or 40 years ago, we wouldn't have started off from where we are now, but trying to retrofit things like basic email security and so on is incredibly difficult. Not only just in terms of what you do, but in terms of even if you could decide on the new standards, how can you retrofit them? And I guess just finally, I mean, it's kind of again, much more challenging than it was when the original internet protocol was designed, because there are so many major players. There's all this sort of US versus China versus Europe kind of thing, and God knows where the UK is going to end up post-Brexit. I don't think it's nice to think we'll be like a nice agile player who can kind of work all between them, but frankly, we're actually just a rather small country. Like, you know, as it's been said, there are only two sorts of European countries. There are small European countries and countries that haven't yet realized they're small European countries. So, you know, the whole thing is likely to be submerged between government, big governments, US and China, etc., but also big companies, Huawei, you know, versus the other big players, and Apple, Google, etc., each pulling for their own best interests. And if we're not careful, you know, what's actually best for the internet as a whole might become just a kind of plaything between these huge players. So I'm rather concerned about that.
Nigel, just a few words, and then we'll take the final comment or question after that, because we do have to close soon. Nigel Hickson.
Sorry, I was muted. Sorry, Olivia, I was muted. Let's take a final. I mean, I think Philip's made some important points, and yeah, I mean, whatever we do, we might find our voices just becomes irrelevant because of global forces. But let's see. So yeah, Olivia, take a final comment, because I know you have a deadline.
Yes, I mean, I'd love to continue, but the problem is we've only put 1 hour. We'll try and do more in the next one. Let's have Shiva Subramanian Muthusamy for a comment or a question.
Olivia, this is Shiva Subramanian from ISOC India Chennai chapter, and so far the discussions progressed on new normal has automatically happened. Political changes, newer business models, the way we meet and interact, and some of these changes are positive. Is there some way by which we could make use of the opportunity and the changes of the new normalcy and take it one step further by not making core changes in the internet, but in the manner in which we interact, in the manner in which we participate to generate more ideas for such progress, macro progress. Thank you.
Yeah, and it's good to see you on the call. Indeed, it's always nice to hear your input, and I know you made a major input into a lot of these discussions, not least at the IGF. I think, you know, on your points, I mean, I think these are the exact discussions that we should be having at the IGF, and that's, you know, why I mentioned earlier that I think it's an important fora this year.
Thanks for this, Nigel. It's Olivia speaking. So I've seen, looking at the Zoom chat, there is actually a whole life going on there. Very good points being made. Mark mentions, and I'm just going to take that, and of course the whole chat will be made available later on, but there's a proposal now before the IGF MAG submitted by Wood and Atris for an intersessional IGF policy track that addresses standards development relating to security that would involve policymakers, governments, business leaders, and civil society. And so Mark hopes that UK stakeholders will support this proposal and next month's MAG at next month's MAG meeting. That's one point being made. The other point was about the Eurodig happening in a few weeks, actually. And there will indeed be some discussion on this at Eurodig. So it's not the end of the discussion. It's rather the beginning. There's quite a number of other points being made here, but unfortunately we're running out of time. So I wanted to thank first Nigel for joining us, but this is not the end of the discussion. And the reason being that this is just a webinar with some starting point, and I hope it's given you a taste of the kind of discussions we could have here. Next week, we have a follow-up, and the follow-up will be a debate. So we'll have some panelists, and Louise Marie Hurrell, who is on the call, will be leading this. I was going to give the floor to Louise Marie to give us a little intro on that. Of course, we'll put all the details on the website, on the ISOC England website, isoc-e.org website. But Louise, could you please share with us the name, because I know you've got them, the name of the panelists, and what are we going to have next week, and when?
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, absolutely.
Hi. So next week we'll have, as Olivier said, this is just the start of the conversation. I do think that we are in a moment, as we've been discussing for the past hour or more, about what is the future of internet governance, what are the stakeholders that need to be engaged. And I do think that we're facing a moment that provides not only, a lot of questions about what's the role of the internet in our society. I remember one of the comments in our call now was just that, the internet is, the infrastructure that supports most of our activities today. So how do we actually think about what the COVID-19 crisis brings to us in this moment? So we're unpacking a bit of that. It's going to be more of a high level discussion, and it's COVID-19 and the future of internet governance. And we'll have 5 speakers, sorry. We'll have Professor Robin Mansell from LSE's Department of Media and Communications. We'll also have Fabrizio Hochschild. He is the Undersecretary General. He's the assistant to the Secretary General. He's working on the digital cooperation and the high-level panel on digital cooperation as well, and the Agenda 2030. So it will be really interesting to hear his perspective on how the UN has been adapting in this moment, not only in terms of COVID, but also thinking the digital cooperation agenda in the coming year. We'll also have William Drake from the University of Zurich. I think most of you already know him. Joyce Hakema from Chatham House, and Chris Buckridge from RIPE NCC. So as you can see, we have a huge, an amazing set of panelists. It will be an interactive discussion. So hopefully we'll see you next week. It will be on Friday next week, so May 29th at 3:30 until 5 BST. So we'll be circulating the details, but I hope you're already excited, and I hope you actually get to join us in this discussion. Thank you.
Sounds great.
Thanks very much for this, Louise. That sounds great indeed. Yes, I'm discovering part of it as well as you're saying it, because it's a work in progress. But it's great to be able to have this. I wanted to thank everyone for coming to this call, for attending, for contributing to the chat. Of course, Nigel, thank you so much for getting us back on track and stop thinking about COVID-19 and more about the things that matter. So it's great to see you, and we look forward, of course, to the next weeks. This is all, as I said, recorded. We will have it on the ISOC website shortly, depending on how much time it takes to process and to put it all together. And of course we'll have the slide deck, I believe, also on the website, isoc-e.org. So thanks to everyone, and thanks to you, and hoping to see you all next week on Friday at 3:30 p.m. BST, which is 14:30 UTC for those people that are in the rest of the world. Anyway, more details on isoc-e.org, and I hope that you've all enjoyed this. Have a very good morning, afternoon, evening, or night, but for most of us, very good evening. Take care.
Thank you very much for the dialogue. It's been great. Thank you.
Thank you.